I'm really, really proud to announce our first speaker and a particular highlight. And I'm not only saying that because the guy used to be my boss, so I can say whatever I want because he's not my boss anymore, so I'm now free to speak at liberty. But I can say that Mark Porter is an amazing technologist that I have learned a lot about how to be a great technology leader. He's the CTO of MongoDB, a company that obviously doesn't need any introduction. I'm sure many of you use MongoDB for your production deployments, for your code. But more than that, he had a very, very storied career after the last few decades in technology. As I said, when he was my boss, he was a CTO of Grab, Southeast Asia's leading super app. And before that, he had senior leadership positions at AWS, Oracle, and many other world-renowned companies. So I think Mark has just been like an amazing inspiration, and I'm really proud that we have the opportunity to have him in Cluj. Please all give a very warm welcome to Mark Porter.
Thank you very much. Hey, everybody. Wow, that is loud. How are we doing today? Are we doing good? Hello? So let's try something. Hi, I'm Mark. Hi, Techsylvania. Say hi, Mark. Good. This can be participatory. It doesn't have to be just me talking. Philip said some amazing things in his conversation about me that are really nice and are really humbling. I'm going to try and measure up to those today. So, like Philip said, it's great to be back together. And it's great for you to give the gift of your time to Techsylvania and to me. And I'm going to try and make it worthwhile. The first thing is, all those ways you see on the screen in green are how you can get in touch with me. Apparently, I love tech in all the different ways you can love tech on Twitter, LinkedIn, and everything else. Today, I'm going to be breezing through an awful lot of content. And you don't need to take pictures of it. You don't need to read the slides. It's all going to be available on the Techsylvania website and on YouTube. So with that, let's go. This is not a tech talk. This is not a talk about frameworks. This is not a talk about languages. It's about building teams, leaders, and culture. Philip said a lot of what's up on the slide right now. I have had the privilege of leading teams from 3 to 1,000 in industries from e-commerce to cloud providers to back-end infrastructure to even ride-hailing at Grab, which I'll talk about here today. I've had roles from developer to founder to CTO to board member and back to CTO. And what I've found is that culture, engineering culture in particular, is the largest determiner of success for companies, for teams, and for individuals in their careers. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. My definition of culture for the purpose of this talk is an organization's culture is made up of the spoken and written practices and rules, things like policies and JIRAs and culture websites and all that, which drive how humans and systems interact. Humans are part of the system. Systems are part of the system. In fact, we encode our culture into our systems by determining what data we put in them, who can search it, who can approve things. So when you're thinking about culture, think about the entire company. A good culture has a lot of characteristics, but the one that I find most important is that it gives a predictable place for people to function. Even a culture which has toxic elements can be okay if it's predictable and people can learn to work around those elements. It's pervasive at all levels, meaning that you talk about it in hiring and firing and reviews and in meetings. And it's spoken and written. It's not just on posters. But wait, we think it's spoken and written. But most companies, some or all of their culture is not spoken or written. It's unwritten. And this is bad. Because new employees come to the company, they can't figure out how to behave. They can't figure out what the rules of engagement are that matter. And business divisions inside a company can diverge from the culture to the point where the two business divisions can't even work together. So it's best to have a culture which is written and spoken. Because culture affects every one of the things you see on this slide. In particular, and the most important thing, it affects how decisions are made. And if I was to interview, I know a lot of you are in the tech industry with me, if I was to interview at a company, the very first question I ask is who makes the decisions and how are they made? What data is needed? How is it presented? Who has the power? Who has the influence? So that's why culture is important. So today, I'm going to have two halves of the talk. First, I'm going to examine 4 different cultures. Then I'm going to tell you about my culture, my preferred culture. And along the way, I'm going to wax a little bit philosophical about how humans interact with each other. But first, an important disclaimer. I'm going to say some pretty strong things about some of these companies. I admire them, and I admire most of their leaders. You'll be able to figure that one out during the talk. I wish all 4 companies well, and I just want to be sure that we all know everything I'm about to quote them on has been something they have said. But I might have achieved success differently than some of these companies. There's many ways to achieve success, but they all think about culture very, very differently. So the 4 companies I'm going to talk about are on the screen. Clearly, I'm the CTO of one. I've been the CTO of another, and I was a general manager at another and a vice president at another. I also was an individual contributor at a lot of them. Today, I'm going to ask you to participate. Listen to these 4 cultures, and then I'm going to tell you about a 5th, and think about 2 more cultures. The culture you have at your company and the culture you wish you had at your company, and compare and contrast. That's how you're going to get value from this talk. So let's start with Amazon. I worked for AWS, and it's one of the most successful companies in the world, and I was there for 6 years. And here's how Jeff Bezos, the CEO, thinks about culture. He thinks that culture is stable, hard to change, slow-moving. He also thinks that when you write about culture, you actually discover it, because there is a culture at every company. And when you write about it and you pass that by people, you discover it. The next thing he thinks is that it's an opt-in, it self-selects. What does that mean? It means that for most strong companies, if you don't like the culture, you can opt out of the culture by leaving the company. They're not opt-in cultures. Andy Jassy, formerly CEO of AWS and now CEO of Amazon, had something else to say. He believes that culture is essential to scaling. Andy Jassy scaled AWS from he was the first employee, to somewhere north of 100,000 employees today. He should know about scaling. So with each of these 4 companies, I'm going to show you some of their leadership principles. Not going to spend a lot of time. This will all be on the website. They had 10, they had 14, now they have 16. And they're pretty cool. But they talk about one thing. They talk about leaders. You can see on the screen, they're all about leaders, leaders, leaders. It's very much an I culture. It's an if I do something right, everything will go well. And that's going to contrast with a couple of the other cultures I'm going to talk about. They start with the customer, and they end with deliver results, because they only had 14 principles until recently. And that's pretty cool. We start with the customer, we deliver results. The 12 principles in the middle are how we make that happen. Now, the last 2 were added in 2021. Amazon was going through a really hard time. High attrition, bad public image. So they added these 2. The 15th one is all about internal, being a great employer, caring about employers. Took them 25 years to add this to their culture. The last one is about being a good steward of the world. Amazon is obviously huge. These are great principles. They're like a recipe. I mean, with 16 of them, fundamentally, you can almost be programmed. They're mostly about business. They're mostly about I, not we. And only 3 of them are about being a better human being. Maybe 4. They're pervasive. We hire people on these 16 principles. I'm not there anymore. They hire people based on these principles. They fire them based on the principles. They review and promote them based on the principles. And they're mentioned literally every day in every document. Over 1 million employees live by these principles. Strong culture. Okay, let's change gears. Oracle, a completely different culture. I worked there for 12 years, along actually with my beautiful wife, who's here with me today. She's my hard audience, by the way. And I was in the database team, and the last 3 years there, I worked directly for Larry. And what was exciting about that was I got to see the culture all the way from being an individual contributor all the way up to the executive staff. What follows are my personal reflections on Oracle culture. And that's important because Oracle didn't have a culture written down when I was there. If you searched for it, you'd find literally nothing. Was there a culture? Oh yeah, there was a culture. In fact, it was one of the strongest cultures I've ever been part of. How does that work? It works because the company all worked for Larry. I'm going to tell you about something he did. On Mondays, he had his meeting with his directs. Tuesdays, they had their meetings. Wednesdays, they had their meetings. By Friday, every single group in the company had a staff meeting. So whatever Larry thought was important on Monday morning, every person in a 25,000-person company at that time knew what Larry thought. I mean, it's top-down, taken to the infinite degree, and it worked. Thank heavens Larry was right so often, or the company wouldn't have done well. But boy, it is not a gentle culture. It's about winning. It's about growth. It's about taking over things hostily. He did have some things that he felt very strongly about. Taking care of employees, making money. Management by ridicule. This is actually a quote Larry said, that he embraced this as a way to run his company. So did it work? Sure. Was it really a great culture? Probably not. And so these are my reflections on Oracle's culture while I was there. Leader-led, or Larry-led, depending on how you want to think about it, clear direction. Everyone at Oracle knew what we had to do. We had to make money. Technical excellence. It was predictable. But frankly, it was never very fun. And very few people at Oracle ever felt safe. And when you don't feel safe, you don't take risks. And when you don't take risks, you can't innovate. Innovation at Oracle was hard. Well, then they came up with some principles. And I don't know when they did this, it was after me. And these principles are pretty good. 6 out of 10 of them are about being a better human being, which was missing when I was there. They're all encompassing in the whole work experience. I have no idea if they're pervasive or whether the culture is truly still a Larry-driven culture. So let's shift gears again. Philip gave me a very, very kind introduction. I loved working at Grab, and I had the privilege of being a CTO of transport at Grab. For those of you who don't know, Grab is the Uber, DoorDash, PayPal, Gidir of Southeast Asia, serving 650 million people in 9 countries. It's a fantastic company. And here's what their CEO has to say, my boss, has to say about their culture. It's mission-based. It's about elevating the quality of life. I mean, you didn't see any of this stuff in Amazon and Oracle. It's not a soft culture, though. Iron sharpens iron. What does that mean? It means that he wants his employees to challenge each other regularly while still creating a nurturing environment. I don't know about you, but this feels pretty good to me, certainly compared to Oracle and the other cultures. But it's more than that. Anthony and Hui-Ling, his co-founder, took it one step farther, where they talked about humility to serve, hunger to execute, and keeping your word, both as a company and individual. Now, I don't know about you, but that's a company I want to get behind their values. They only have 4. They have honor, be a good human. They have heart, treat people with love, even with your customers. I had drivers cry on my shoulder because we had given them an income that they'd never had before. There's hunger, which is go get stuff done. Realize there's grit, and then there's humility. And these are pretty good. There's only 4 of them. And let me talk a little bit more about humility. Hui-Ling, the co-founder of Grab, talks about humility, and she talks about how important it is. Humility's symbol at Grab is an ear. It means you should shut up and listen, because if you listen, you can find what people are really thinking. You can disrupt yourself. You can be humble to know what you're doing wrong and what you're doing right. And it was a pleasure and a privilege to work with Wheeling as well. So, the summary here, there's only 4 of them. They're 3/4 about being a better human, and there's a social mission. But I want to point out one thing. You didn't see the word I in a single one of those principles. Asia is a very communal, team-based culture. So their principles reflect that. North America is more of a hero culture, so their principles reflect that. It doesn't matter what the culture is. It matters that it is right for that company at that time, and it's self-consistent. So we've looked at 3 companies. Now I'm going to wax a little bit and talk about my own, MongoDB. We're 15 years old. We have 4,000 employees now. We're over $1 billion in revenue. The subject of my talk was scaled up to startup to scaled up. Are we scaled up? I don't know, probably compared to a lot of your startups. Are we scaled up compared to Amazon? Not at all. So we're still on that journey. Let's see what happens there. And I'm going to start with a quote from my boss, David Echeria, the CEO. He talks about being the conductor of an orchestra. He talks about making music. How inspirational. At one level, it feels pretty hands-off working for Dave. Dave says, you own the string section, Mark, make the strings work. In another way, he says, I am accountable for making the entire orchestra work. So it is both a hands-off empowered culture and a very, very accountable culture. And that balance is hard to find. So let's see how he does it. These are our 6 principles. They're all pretty explanatory, so I'm not going to go into them in depth. I'm going to dive into a couple because they are a little bit different. Our thinking big principle is exactly what you'd expect. It talks about pioneering and innovation and dreaming big. I mean, there's nothing really surprising there. What is nice is that we call out what the principle means in a document. Good, so people know what that means in detail. But we do something I've never seen any other company do. We call out what it isn't, so that new employees come to the company from other cultures, and on day 1 of arriving, when they have their onboarding, they know things they're not supposed to do. And that makes our employees more successful. And in fact, our onboarding team says they regularly get thanked for the what it isn't part. So let's dive into that a little bit. We have a principle called Embrace the Power of Differences about diversity, inclusion, and belonging. It's a great principle. Pretty awesome. But it also has a couple things about what it isn't. We explicitly say that we will never lower the hiring bar to get diversity. Instead, we'll just work harder. We explicitly say that smart jerks don't belong at the company. And people know that the first day. So when someone says, hey, you're not embracing the power of differences, they know they're being a smart jerk. We also talk about being intellectually honest. And on the left, it says, hey, say things with candor that needs to be said. Everybody says that in their principles. That's not surprising. But look on the right. It says you're not allowed to use candor as an excuse for being an ass or a jerk. You have to figure out how to speak respectfully. And yet, you're not allowed to just shut up either. You have to say things. You can't be weak. You have to say things. And so that gives people guardrails. Own what you do. This one is a really interesting one, and it's one of the most powerful principles that I wish every company had in their culture. At our company, you are supposed to only say things about someone that you would say if they were in the room with you. No talking behind people's backs, no politics. Now, I'm not saying it doesn't occur, but I'm saying we have a principle that reminds people regularly that that's just not okay. So this is the last culture I'm reviewing. I like the mix. I like the fact there's 6. I like the fact that it's pervasive. And all in all, it's a pretty great culture. So I've talked about these. They're different. Some are top-down, some are bottom-up, some are predictable, some are less predictable. All of them are internally self-consistent. And so when you think about the culture you want to have, I hope these 4 companies have given you some ideas. Now we're going to move into the second part of the talk, and we're going to talk about organizations, tenets, and trust, because there's a lot of things that culture doesn't cover. So first, let's start with talking about organizations. This is an org structure you're all used to. Everyone reports neatly. It all works great. The problem is that who you influence and who influences you and your success is not drawn on this org chart. What's drawn on this org chart is some mythical view. And so a culture that doesn't recognize that this isn't exactly how power works is at fault. Now, there are an awful lot of ways to have cultures. I mean, everyone has an org chart like the one in the upper left. But there are other cultures, too. There are cultures where there's no real structure. Where power is totally unpredictable. There's cultures where everybody knows where power is, and it's in the seat of one person, typically the CEO. There are cultures where the approval structure and org structure is so incomprehensible that people just stumble around trying to figure out what it is. And there are cultures, this is an actual slide with actual company names on it that I got off the internet. I've taken the names off to protect those companies, where they believe that in the name of healthy competition, the divisions should actually fight with each other. I mean, that's terrible, but there are companies out there that do that. The point is that culture is great, org structure matters, and their interaction is what works with you every day. So let's talk about that a little bit more, because designing organizations is something I've been doing for 30 years. I'm still learning. I want to talk to you about a rule that many of you may have heard of called Conway's Law. Conway's Law states that the product that you produce will resemble the communication and organizational structure that produced it. You've often heard the phrase, "we ship our org." And what this means is that people relationships and power dynamics turn into product relationships. And so the designers and implementers in Team A have to talk to the designers and implementers in Team B, and if Manager A and Manager B don't get along with each other, you're going to have a bad product, it's going to have bad testing, and you're eventually going to have a bad customer outcome. So think about the product you want to build. Now, many of you are in startups of 10 people, 20 people. This doesn't matter for that. But when you scale to 20, 30, 50, 100, 1,000, think about the product you're trying to build and literally put that up on the wall. Now, why am I wasting your time telling you this? This feels pretty obvious. Because the mistake people make is they take their best performers, their loudest speakers, the people who are earliest at the company, and they let them have positions which do not obey this rule. Sometimes you have to tell your best performer, this is the team I need you to be in. This is what the company needs. So you have to have the strength to do that. Not only that, if you structure your teams right, and I'm going to bridge to small teams here in a second, if you structure your teams right, you automatically get modern software. If you structure your teams wrong, you automatically get legacy monolithic software. So I've talked about orgs. Let's talk about tenets. What is a tenet, and why am I talking about it? A tenet is a rule, a principle, belief, or a doctrine held by a team, typically an organization. And why are these important? Because they're what happens in the unspoken halls. They happen when people open up their editor and they decide whether to put that air checking code in when they first check in or at some distant point in the future. They happen every day. And here I'm talking about technical tenets. And so I'm going to let you read this slide for a second and think about if your customers ever experience any of these things. I think we can all agree that customers feel this way. And we all agree that software should be reliable, that software should be scalable, all these things, but we don't say it very often. And in particular, when we do our startups, we focus on features, 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 because that's what we got funded to do. You have to transition to be a more mature company as you work your way towards profitability in your Series B. And so I've come up with something called the onion of requirements. And what this means, an onion has layers, and what this means is that each inner layer is more important than the outer layers. And you need to, if needed, give up on some of the outer layer stuff to get the inner layer stuff. It's very important. And this is how you build a healthy company, like an AWS RDS or a MongoDB or a Grab. And you have to get everyone, even your product managers and your salespeople and your marketing people, to think of these layers of the onion as features all the way out. From security, which we all know is job one these days. Durability, I'm a database guy, so I also have to throw in correctness of the data. Availability, in this global 24/7 world, availability is a must-have. Scalability, and finally, operability. Operability because we all run managed services these days, and you have to have all 6 of these things. The thing is, customers expect these 6 things, and they're never going to ask you for them. They're just going to be mad when you mess up. And that's the way it really works. They're going to ask you for number 7, features, and they're going to expect 1 through 6. So we've talked about tenets. Now let's talk about trust. Why am I talking about trust? I'm going to start talking about trust with anthropology, because trust is a lower brain function. Intellect and writing code is an upper brain function, and so anthropology is where we need to start. There's a Professor Dunbar in Cambridge who in the 80s and 90s did research on how human brains work and how primate brains work. And what he found was that there was a fundamental limit to the number of people that could form a stable, cohesive group. And the paper's in the talk, if you want to look it up later, it's amazing. And he found this, and he found that if you had to interact closely with people bigger than your Dunbar number, it wasn't going to go well. Approval, politics, backstabbing. But if you worked with people within your Dunbar number, you're like, oh, they must not have meant to check in that bad code. They must have had a bad day. And so it all came down to the way the brain actually works. So as he did his research over the 80s and 90s, he landed on this number of about 150. Pretty amazing number. Now the reason it's amazing is because after he was done with his research on primates, he went and he found that throughout history, Roman legions, armies in the US Army today, Neolithic villages in remote places such as the Amazon, which never had a chance to hear my talk, actually went and had formed groups. And when a village in the Amazon gets above 100 to 120, it splits out and they form another village in the next valley over. It's amazing. In companies, it's been shown, and there are papers that show that once you get above about 150 people, approval processes spring out of nowhere. And then he did more research. Social networks appeared. And surprisingly, he found that even though you might have 800 Facebook friends, you really only have maybe 150, ones that you actually care about what they say. And so he kept doing research. And when he did this research, he found something even more amazing, because he had computers now to help him. He found layers. He found that there are different layers of trust. Look, every one of you has 5 people you would die for, or they would die for you. We all have those 15 closest friends, or those 30 people we see for lunch every 6 months. And then we have that people who have 1,500 who are like, I don't trust them, I'm nice to them, but I don't like them. Why is this important? This is so important for tech, because as your company scales, you're going to find out that trust and orgs and code, first time I've mentioned code in the talk, actually interact with each other. If you have to work with more people than your Dunbar number, now mine's about 50, I'm a developer, I'm pretty closed in. My wife sitting there is about 400. She's in marketing, and she just makes friends willy-nilly and trusts people all the time. But your personal Dunbar number, if you have to work with more people than that, you will find yourself uncomfortable. And then I created my own corollary to this statement, which is around code. The single most intimate thing you can share as a developer is your address space. Someone with a stack violation, a wild pointer, can cost you a month of debugging, can cost you a promotion, can cost your company succeeding. So if you have to work with more people in your address space, in your stack, in your heap, than your Dunbar number, refactor your code. So we've talked about these three things, and what do they actually mean? The things on the left, culture, org, tenets, Dunbar's number, yeah, they add up to great teams. We all feel great about ourselves. It turns out that they actually add up to modern software development. They add up to small teams working independently with strong APIs. And that means that if you apply these principles, your company will be healthier, and it will all of a sudden be easier to develop software. And you won't quite know why, but it's really because the humans are just getting along better together. So how does this all relate to MongoDB and the culture that I'm promoting? I'm going to talk about a little bit about MongoDB right now and my culture that I am working on putting there. This is not MongoDB's culture yet. What I have found is that if people speak truths to each other and you protect them when they speak truths and they're said with good intent, that's important. That means everyone speaks truth to each other. And by the way, one truth is, I don't want to tell you, but at least it's a truth. The next thing is you give them context. You give them surprising amounts of information. Reed Hastings, in his book, No Rules Rules, he's the CEO of Netflix, wrote about this in depth, and I'd advise you to read it. He transformed Netflix into a more amazing company by telling everyone everything he could tell them. Why? So that they felt empowered, so they felt they had the information needed to make decisions. But that's not enough. You have to empower people to make those decisions. You have to kill approval processes. You have to kill all these things which make you feel like you work for the Borg. And you have to make every person feel like an owner when they come to the company every day. And how do you do that? You get rid of approvals. At MongoDB, we have something called LGTM, looks good to me. You might think that me, as the CTO of a 1,000-person engineering organization, approve a lot of things. I actually approve almost nothing. People put proposals in front of me, and I put my looks good to me or I'm concerned. Now, sometimes when I think they're way off track and I think they're dead wrong, I will struggle and I will say, have you considered this carefully? That's the best I can do. So you have to let people do this. You have to let people make mistakes. And everyone talks these days about embracing failure. I'm not a fan of that meme. I mean, I'll tell you right now, if I was to embrace failure as the CTO, my board of directors would embrace another CTO. But embrace experimentation. And the way to do this is to call out experimentation in the product description. Call out that the following three things might happen. Call out that you don't know what's going to happen with this part. By doing that, you've taken the politics out of the situation. Because when things do go that unexpected direction, which some people might call wrong, you've already told them that. There's no surprise. There's no loss of, wait for it, trust. Because you told them at the beginning. This adds up to engagement, employees wanting to move the company forward. They want to be owners, not employees. It adds up to accountability. Because employees who are respected and respectful, who have all the information they need, who can make their own decisions and drive their own destiny, and who feel safe they will not be summarily punished, are more engaged and actually beg for accountability. We had this at Grab. We have this at MongoDB. So what has this created at MongoDB? We have a great feedback culture. We have wonderful quarterly planning where people come into the meetings, they say their piece. There might be 100 people in a planning meeting. I mean, that's crazy. It's bottoms up, bottoms up. But we make decisions fast. We set a deadline every week for the decisions that need to be made that week. It's made our leaders feel safe saying, I don't know how to be a leader. I was hired as an intern here 4 years ago, and I need leadership training. And they feel safe because we've told them that it's okay to not know what your job is. We hope and we drive towards optimal collaboration and communication. And this has produced positive business outcomes for our company. And the business results show it. Huge downloads, huge revenue growth, huge employee engagement. So we've talked about so much today. This talk was not about me. This talk was about you. And I want to give you things to think about. Your company, how the humans at your company interact, your career, what you're going to do, and whether you're at the right place to do it or whether you can change your company in the right place to do it. Your impact on the universe. I'm hoping this is all coming through, and it all comes down to how humans interact at your company. And so, I've been waiting to give this talk for 30 years. I spent like 2 weeks on this talk. I've learned from leaders who I reported to. Some I liked, some I didn't. I've had leaders report to me who didn't like me or did like me. Philip was very kind. I've had leaders I've admired from afar and never talked to. And what I've tried to do is compress all of those learnings of 30 years into 30 minutes. Thank you so very much for your time today.
Thank you so much, Mark.
Thank you.
I hope a lot of you learned from Mark. He's going to be available, as I said earlier, directly after this on the Q&A stage. So please enjoy his wisdom while he's here. He's also going to be around in Cluj for the next 2 days. So he's looking to meet highly talented technologists. So do find Mark on LinkedIn. And yeah, hopefully you can learn as much as I was able to. Thank you very much, Mark, for making it.
Tom, I hope to talk.
Yes.
Okay.